Mission of India, a title whose modesty belies his significant role in Indian economic policy over many years. On my immediate right is Kalpana Morparia, Chief Executive Officer of JP Morgan. Next to her, Rajat from the ADB in Manila. Then we have Shumeet Banerji, CEO of Booz and Company and one of the co-chairs of the summit. Beyond Montek is Lars Thunell, CEO of the IFC in Washington, and the creator of the Swedish model. And then on the far side, Raghuram Rajan from the University of Chicago. As we were preparing for the session earlier, Montek challenged me to make the session as provocative as I possibly could. He said that the best way that we could make it provocative would be for him not to say anything. But I think we all want to hear a few words from Montek to kick off the session. We'll try and make it as interactive and as much of a dialogue as we possibly can. So this morning, Montek, the Prime Minister said that India grew at 6.7% in fiscal year 08-09. Expected to grow at 6.5%, 09-10, and that in the medium term could look to 8 to 9% annual growth. Do you agree with your boss?
Yeah. No, I not only agree with that, but I think if you want to dispute that, we can have a good dispute on it too. Sure.
Well, let me ask you a question then, straight off. The number of tasks that India is asking itself to perform adequately to reach this sort of level of sustained growth are manifold and cover a whole range of different policy options, from infrastructure development, we just heard from Minister Nath, from education and health, which the Prime Minister talked about this morning, ensuring that rural incomes continue to rise while managing one of the most extensive urbanization developments that the world has ever seen. There is an extraordinary challenge of governance here for a governance system that has not in the past been known, if I can put it this way, for breathtaking efficiency. How are you going to do it all?
Well, your first point is, it seems to me that your skepticism seems to be based on what's happened in the past. The first thing to get on record is that for the 5 years before the crisis, we did average 9% growth. So we're not talking about something that the country hasn't achieved. It's done it for 5 years in a row. And my guess is that in the year immediately before that thing started, if somebody had asked, is it capable of doing it, you would have had the same doubts and questions and so on. Now, I think the answer really is that it's absolutely true that there are many reform-related initiatives that are always on the agenda. And, you know, being an open, very pluralistic, participative kind of politics, every one of these appears to be controversial in one dimension or another. But if you look at the last 10 or 15 years, the fact of the matter is we've handled these problems and we moved ahead. And I'm making the assumption that our ability to handle these problems has not diminished. And you know, the way to describe the present situation is an economy that grew at 9% for 5 years, got shocked off that growth trajectory because of what happened in the global financial and real markets, is knocked off it for 2 years, that is 2008, 2009, and 2009, 2010. This year is not just the continuing slowdown, it's also the drought, which had an impact. Next year, we will expect to have a normal monsoon. The world isn't going to get back to normal very quickly, at least not what we used to think of as normal. But, you know, I think there are inherent strengths on the supply side which make it possible for India to grow. And that implies that we'll be able to handle these constraints. Now, what's the most important of these constraints? Infrastructure.
Right.
This is something on which, number one, there's no disagreement. I didn't hear my distinguished colleague, Mr. Kamal Nath. I'm sure he must have emphasized the importance of infrastructure. Everybody agrees. This is what the government has to do if it wants to be serious. I don't think there's any big political controversy about this. There's no political party that will get up and say, we don't want infrastructure. There may be arguments about how you implement it here, implement it there. And I think that this is a challenge. I don't want to be glib about it, but I don't see it as a challenge that the system can't respond to. The second concern that some people might have is that if the world's going to be so slow, how come you guys are going to grow at 9%? Well, you know, I mean, sources of growth are usually analyzed on the demand side, traditionally, the assumption being that it's the rest of the world that will provide the demand impetus in terms of exports for developing countries to grow. But, you know, sources of growth are also analyzed on the supply side. I mean, do you have the savings? Do you have the private sector capability? Do you have the willingness to invest? Do you have the skills? The moment you look at it on the supply side, I think India has all that is needed to actually take off. Now, other countries have done it. I mean, we're the first one doing it. Japan did it, Korea did it, China did it. So all I'm saying is India is the next one off the block. And yeah, there are challenges. We'll handle them as they come along.
So those who would argue that you have here a particularly disaggregated and dispersed power system with multiple political pressure points, and that might make the governance of economic policy making more difficult than it was in Japan, Korea, China. Somebody had to be the first person to mention China today. Those people who would make that argument, in your view, are fundamentally mistaken.
Well, I think unless you're in favor of a system that essentially enables you to override dissent and disagreement, and there may be some who yearn for that, I don't. But if you're serious about running an open and free society, one of the consequences of it is there's going to be debate. It's true that it's going to take a little bit longer, but in my view, the quality of the consensus that emerges out of that involves much greater participation across the board. And I think in a longer term sense, it's actually more sustainable. So I don't regard the fact that, I don't regard the fact that there's a lot of dissent and differences of view and all the rest of it as examples of dysfunctionality. I think I regard that as an investment in trying to create institutions where differences of view get expressed, sometimes exaggerated, but then out of that process comes some kind of a consensus. And I think the history of issues in India is littered with instances where things were made to look very controversial, and there was a lot of debate and discussion. And then, the debate and discussion continues. They find something else to discuss, but these issues get settled. And that is the principal lesson to learn from the nature of, if you like, the functionality of Indian democracy. If you're not persuaded by that, then I think you're right. Then we've got a problem.
Shumeet Banerji, you fly around the world talking to leading companies, countries all over the world. As you look at India from the outside, from one step removed, what are the 2 or 3 key things that you think in this process of trying to deliver, sustain 8–9% growth with all these manifold challenges that I listed at the beginning? What are the 2 or 3 things that you'd keep an eye on?
So I'd say that the remarkable thing in the last year and a half has been, in traveling around the world, has been my sense of this inversion of the world order, by which I mean that an incident in Brazil 2 weeks ago where the chairman of one of the major banks said to me, in all seriousness, I just wish the Americans would adopt Brazilian bank regulation standards. Now, I think this is astonishing for a number of reasons. 15 years ago, you couldn't have written a fiction piece that had a Brazilian banker saying his regulators were A, good, and provided a model for the Americans. It's just that notion. And you see this so there's a number of countries, Brazil, India, China, big demographic dividends potentially, and a follow-on from the resource-rich countries, sort of a whole new arc of growth around the world, which is very exciting and quite different from anything we've had, and models of how we learn about things that look pretty different. So if I now sort of localize this, and in some ways I suspect, as I speak to leaders in India, the challenge here is still to catch up with the success of India, that in fact in its own self-image, I think the leadership perhaps doesn't quite realize how important it is, what is happening here. So if I might mention 3 areas where I think, I'll be quite specific about this. I think we have a clear record of small and medium enterprise entrepreneurship. Large caps have learned how to compete on capabilities on a relatively global scale. It's a transformed world from 15 years ago. There's still plenty of inefficiency to go around, but I think that's been proven. And I think the combination of policy, gradual regulatory change, capital markets, et cetera, have clearly worked in areas like financial services and telecoms. These are clear success stories in the country. When you talk to the leadership in the country, though, these growth rates, hyper-growth brings big problems. 50, 30% growth rate companies. And the number one issue you'll hear from leaders is around skills. The ability to generate the numbers of people, not just derivatives traders, of whom there are plenty available now, but really, all the way down the ladder. You need security guards and cleaners. I mean, just running enterprise takes people. And I think there is a big skills issue, and I think everyone's well aware of it, but I bring it up from the level of the companies and how those work. Issues around employability, the challenge of making demographics work as a positive force rather than lead to insurgency and so on. The second area I'd mention as particularly problematic outside looking in is that, in fact, I do think that law in India is a massive competitive advantage. It is well understood, it's based on precedent, the nature of legislation and statutes well understood. Regulatory structures look reasonably international in how they're constituted. But there is an enormous stickiness about getting things done. And I think attacking sort of administrative inefficiency at its most basic level strikes me as quite important, not just for foreign companies here, but for companies in general. And on the other side of that, I think that some investments in the courts, in order to actually make this law effective and efficient, is kind of quite an interesting area. So I think the ability to resolve matters of contract relatively quickly in the courts. And then the third area where I suppose it's a somewhat, it isn't so much about competitiveness as an issue that I think is of great importance, which is, I think, the argument on climate change and carbon coming out of India has come along very quickly. But I just take the view here that this is an issue that is completely agnostic to where you're doing it and who did what and when. And the reality is that given the coastal populations and the riverine populations, the impacts on 1/6 of humanity here are going to be as large as, or at least, in other words, I think this affects Indians as much as it affects anyone else. And so acceleration to a leadership position on the carbon debate for India doesn't seem to me to be a choice.
Lars, can I bring you in here? You too look at very different societies, spend your time traveling from Washington, looking at governance structures and private investment all over the world. When you look at India from the standpoint of the IFC, what are the challenges that you see?
Well, first of all, I think we have to note again that India has come through this crisis in a very, very good way compared to many other countries. And I think that in itself shows that we have a debate about whether we had linkages in the global linkages or not. And I think the question of decoupling, I think now we see very clearly that there is another type of linkage, and that's an opportunity, I think, for India, in the sense that we have the growth here, we have this is a big market, and there's an opportunity for firms, whether they are domestic or whether they are foreign, to come in here. And that's what we are trying to focus on and support, is both the SME sector and making it easier for them. There's still an opportunity, I think, for India to improve the easiness for people, entrepreneurs to start companies or operate companies, and the whole administrative apparatus around that. I think that's one area where I think there is a challenge and an opportunity as we move forward. I think one of the things that or another area where I think there is a challenge is and it's well known, as we mentioned again, the infrastructure side. But I want to point at the question of the PPPs, the public-private partnerships, and how to get those to really work together, which, you know, normally in what we see around the world is that everybody wants PPPs, and the private sector thinks that that means that the government take all the risk and they have all the benefits, and the government thinks that they'll get everything for free. You have to figure out how will it actually work, and I think there are some opportunities for improvements there. But I think the most fascinating thing we're seeing now, as I talk to various businessmen around the world, is the huge market opportunity in countries like India, where if you look at it on a total scale, you have the new middle class coming up with huge purchasing power, but also the bottom of the pyramid, the people living on $3,000 a year, which is, if you look at the world, is a market of 4 billion people and $5 trillion. And here I think India has been on the forefront on finding new ways of exploiting that market or getting to that market, both in terms of product development. Think about the nano car. We're doing some things, some fascinating things done by the financial industry here with smart cards and biometrics and other things. There are new distribution systems coming up, and I think that's an area where you can then, and we're actually working with a number of companies now from India, helping them to go abroad and become real true regional or even global players with some new technologies. And I think that's extremely interesting.
A couple of points, there I'd love to come back to in the discussion. Kalpana, Morparia, there's been a healthy, very interesting debate in the last few months in the US, in the UK, and other places, that the finance sector of the economy just got too big over the last 10 or 20 years, that there was over-innovation, if you like, in finance. And that those economies that had overstressed finance have suffered for it. Was India lucky in avoiding those problems?
You know, the way I would describe it is to say India avoided an accident because we never stepped out of the house. So we can call ourselves lucky because we didn't experiment enough. But if you look at the statistics, they're quite appalling. If you look at financial sector penetration, less than half of the adult population in India does not have access to a simple bank account. When you look at the credit penetration, it's even more dismal. Just about 14% of individual adult population has access to any credit product. Mutual fund penetration, 4% of GDP, insurance barely 20%, and that number appears as high as 20% because some states have basically given an accident policy to their entire population. So I think India has a long way to go if it wants to consistently achieve the 9% and why not a 10% growth trajectory. And that is really to expand its financial sector. Again, in India, we tend to think more incrementally and linearly about this. So we say, let's open more branches. The fact of the matter is 40% of the current branch network of banks in India is in rural.
Compensation mechanism for salary and so on so should be free. So the market as a regulator is a concept. One is, an independent regulator for governance, accreditation, and all of that, which will build some structures for quality. But the demand supply, what to teach, is a market phenomena. And what prices to teach at. Today in this country, I just want to say the market is at work, but illegally. It's at work illegally. So let me look at engineering education. All of us know that in 2002, the private engineering colleges of South India, which used to charge a capitation fee of 1 million rupees, the capitation fee became zero, simply because we had more seats than there were takers. So the market principle worked then. It has worked last year again. We have more seats of engineering than we had takers last year. So the capitation fee, the under the table, whatever else you may call it, which is 10 times the official fee, has vanished when the supply has exceeded demand. MBA education is available at 50,000 rupees a year. It's available at 1.5 million a year. That kind of multiple. So there are, if I may use the term, there are different offerings which different people who can afford will take it. But all this is official, unfortunately. Medical education, which is restricted, a 3 years master to become a dental specialist costs 2.8 million rupees, mostly unofficial, simply because the supply there is very highly constrained. So I want to say that the market as a regulator is an important issue, and I'll come to the third defect, which is the funding defect. So this year, this plan, the government has become very ambitious and said the capital funding from the central government for higher education goes up 10% in this plan, 10 times, sorry, over the last plan. And yet the Planning Commission said this is about 1/10 of what we need. So huge step forward, but a much bigger gap in front. This is the reality. Today we are dealing with this reality and coping with it with largely government funding, some amount of philanthropic funding, and some amount of what I will call as grey funding, which is the 28 lakhs being given unofficially. So these are the three components. And I think when I talk of funding defect to be cleaned up, the question really is, how do we, the government is spending more, but we know we need much more. The philanthropic, not-for-profit players are spending a certain amount, but their hesitation is because of the earlier two defects, the structural defect and the governance defect. If we correct those two defects, this part of funding can improve 3, 4, 5, 10 times. I don't know, maybe. My view is even then we'll be very short. So the fundamental question which the nation has to answer, and in a conversation, a small conversation, the minister said we have to throw it up in the air, is education for profit or not for profit? The law of the land is education is not for profit. Now, we have to come to grips with the fact that if it's not for profit, then the fact that it's unofficially operating for profit has to be closed. Otherwise, you have this unofficial phenomena which breeds a lot of bad practices and distortion. Or if it's for profit, then the rules have to be defined. My own personal view is it'll take a while before the nation accepts the idea of for profit, because most nations in the world still haven't. And I believe, and Richard Levin should tell us, that even in the US it accounts only for 5% of all activity in education, even though there has been for profit from the Second World War. So, should it be for profit, should it not be for profit, is an unanswered question. It's a difficult question to resolve, and it's a question which should have a debate perhaps over a decade, maybe. It'll take a long, long time, because how do we get the funds to meet the needs is a big question. So these three defects, I think, are the ones which I do know Mr. Sibal is confronting, but I'm just perhaps repeating some of the things which have been said before.
Thank you, Rajay. Kapil, I'm going to get you to answer some of Rajay's points, and they're important because he's moving, in some senses, to the kind of reforms process we had in 1991 for the economy itself, calling for that in education, and calling for massive privatization, to use the word massive again. But I'd like to get Bill Green at this point, because Kapil, you had mentioned another point, which is skill development, and the fact that these figures are dismal. Nandan Nilekani, in another context in his book, talked of the demographic dividend, or the advantages that India has of having such a young population, and that competitive thing that it could get us. But we seem to be lacking on this. Bill, what would be your sort of, you've had a multi-billion-dollar company. What would you suggest that India do on this front?
Well, I appreciate the opportunity to be here. I think the first thing on education is we have to recognize it's a means to an end, not an end in itself. The end in itself is competitive nation, it's rising standards of living, it's people that can make a bigger contribution to the world around them. And sometimes I think we tend to solve for education without looking at the outcomes. When you stand back and look at it, I mean, there are three fundamental issues, right? The first one is access, the second one is affordability, and the third one is accountability. And access is, how do we get people in the system? And how do we have a system that has a delivery mechanism that reaches out to where the people are, right? And there are huge challenges around access that we can solve. We can leverage technology. We can build networks like Community College network in the United States. There are a lot of things we can do to improve access. As it relates to affordability, I think every country struggles with what is the proposition for people to be educated. Whether it's for-profit, not-for-profit, it doesn't matter. It's an investment of time if it's not money. And how do we get young people to see that there's a value proposition for them to invest their time in being educated? And I think we have a long way to go to not only educate, but as I say, energize and inspire. Because without motivated learners, none of the investment we make in education serves us well. And in order to get motivated learners in all parts of the country, we need to energize them and inspire them about possibilities. And I think that is incredibly important. And the third thing has to do with accountability. We need to start measuring our education systems on outcomes straight away. And whether it's the supply-demand balance, in other words, we're training people to do what we need them to do, whether it's making sure we deliver good value for money, at the end of the day, whether it's making sure we're creating a workforce that has the skills. And we also need to be very careful not to get distracted by, we do need world-class educational institutions. But we also need to raise the water table in the tank. And world-class educational institutions are incredibly important, right? And they create a lot of buzz, right? But they educate in a vertical slice. And we really have to educate in a horizontal slice, right? We have got to raise the water table in the tank. And what does that mean? It means analytical skill, good judgment, and the ability to communicate. The jobs of tomorrow require analytical and communication skills, regardless of what they are. And so I think we have to not lose sight of that. What are we training people for? I guess the last thing I would just mention is this. I lead a commission in the United States that's tackling, frankly, the same set of problems. Yes, the statistics are different, and yes, the numbers are smaller. But it's no different. And if you look at the United States, we need to overhaul our delivery system of education. There's just no question about it. And I guess I would have one final word for companies. All of us who lead companies have programs around corporate citizenship. And we do a variety of things to help in the communities in which we work and live. In our company, we overhauled our entire corporate citizenship agenda last year on one theme: skills to succeed. And so for the 120 countries that we operate in, we need to put our effort towards raising the water table in the tank as a company. And this whole notion of public-private partnerships, but this whole notion that the most important thing you're solving for is a competitive workforce, and the most important contribution a company can make to its community is to invest in the education system. And it's something that we feel very strongly about, and I think if industries across the globe took on that charge, we could work with countries like this to have a profound difference. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. Ravi, I'm going to move to you. You know, Bill talked about the role of technology in transforming education. We have this unique opportunity, just as we did with the cell phones, not to go back to plain old telephony, leapfrog, go straight to the mobile phones, and create a revolution of its own kind. Is there such a possibility in education, given the sort of technology thing, that the strengths that we have? Can we get virtual universities to bridge this gap that Kapil has talked about? You have to bring it up to 20%. Is technology an answer to any of these things?
Yes.
And why?
What else do you expect from somebody who comes from the industry to say? The answer clearly is yes, and you know, there are lots of people today in companies like Microsoft who are devoting endless cycles trying to figure out how to apply technology to this problem. But the real problem we're trying to solve for actually is breaking this false tension or dichotomy between quality and quantity, okay? That seems to be one of the fundamental trade-offs, and the only way you can reach the kind of scale numbers that CK was talking about yesterday is by using IT. But the answer, again, turns out to be not just simply dropping more PCs in classrooms or broadcasting lectures on EduSat and so forth. Those are necessary, they're somewhat helpful. But fundamentally, we've got to disrupt how learning happens in the classroom. And so the things that we are very, very excited about is some of the work that's happening in pedagogy in places like Carnegie Mellon or companies like Pearson Learning. And so there, what people are doing is taking advantage of computers to improve the engagement between teacher and student, between students themselves so that they can discuss topics in real time, so that you can have little simulations as subjects are being taught, continuously having as mini assessment of the student, where are they learning, how are they learning, providing feedback, etc. And there's some staggering results from this kind of work, okay? For instance, for a hard statistics course, they found that using this kind of blended learning technique, online, offline, a group of students was able to get to the same level of proficiency in about half the time. Also, interestingly, using a pure online method, they got to the same sort of outcome levels as the offline, the classroom conventional method. So I think technology plays a very, very important role. But fundamentally, Raj, I think there's a more important question out here. You know, it's about moving from debate to action, moving from discussing what to how. Unlike my iconic fellow panelists, you know, I'm not an expert on higher education. I haven't set up a university the way Raji has and so forth. But, you know, it strikes me that there are any number of experts who've walked this ground before us. You know, the Yashpal Commission report, there's the NK's National Knowledge Commission report. And while they may disagree on some things, on the fundamental transformation agenda, they agree. They agree we've got a system that is over-regulated, yet under-governed, okay? And they're all calling for an independent regulator for higher education. There's a clear sense that we've got to do a triage of our system. There are too many bad institutions which need to be shut down, a lot more which need to be upgraded, and a lot more new universities to be opened. But where's the funding for that? It can't clearly come from the government alone. So, hey, let's roll out the red carpet for Yale and Harvard. Let's get private sector players into the game. So, and of course, around the use of technology. So the issue is not what. I think there's more and more convergence on at least a core agenda. The issue seems to be how. And, you know, fortunately now, for the first time in a long time, we seem to have the kind of political leadership which is open-minded and sort of open to reform. But do we still know how to drive change and transformation on a system of this scale? You know, ours is a mid-sized company. We have 90,000 employees, and it's impossibly hard to change. Because why? You've got to create urgency for change. You've got to have a clear vision and get people sort of saying, hey, let's move in that direction. You've got to find out stakeholders and where is the pockets of resistance and try and deal with that. In a system of this magnitude, where you've got every child, every teacher, every parent, bureaucrats, politicians involved, a democracy, change is completely non-trivial. So I actually think that the question to the panel is more around the how, far beyond what, and far beyond technology, which is the original question you asked.
Thank you, Ravi. We're going to come back to that question very, very significantly. I'd like to get Anand in at this point. And moving back to skill development, one of the problems has been that vocational education, when you say vocational, it looks like you're a failure. You couldn't get through regular degree, therefore you're doing these kind of other courses that's there. How do we break the stigma that's there? And as Raji had mentioned, a certain mobility between these, that I can take these various skills without having to feel inferior in any way.
Two thoughts here to respond to your question, Raj. One is clearly skills education has to become respectable. And respectability is a social construct. And therefore, change in mindset is going to be a foundation to that happening, number one. And second is employer-centric. When you therefore ask for employment or look for employees, the more you demand that they have certain types of skills rather than just degrees, you're automatically going to bring in the economic angle to it, and therefore a combination of both is going to make a big difference. But let me just roll back and just touch upon 2 or 3 points, and particularly taking on from what Raji had talked about. To me, the biggest problem that we face today when we keep talking about education, reforms, and all of that is a temporal problem. We don't have time. We are in a situation today, India is in a situation today where both from a social and an economic perspective, if you have to talk about the significant change, we really don't have time available. We talk about demographic dividend, we talk about aspiration levels being built in youngsters in India, but the transition time from aspiration to desperation to despondency is actually pretty quick. And when that happens, we get into all kinds of social issues that we are able to today see in pockets of India. And therefore, it's time to walk the talk rather than keeping on doing talk the talk. I think that's one big point that I would like to place on the table, number one. Number two, a lot of our, and going back to the topic about mindset, a lot of what we talk about is predicated on what we have held dear since the last many years. Not much of it is predicated on what needs to be done for the country, perhaps, going forward. And therefore, some of the values that drive our thinking perhaps need to be enhanced, perhaps other values needed to get added on for us to be able to arrive at a solution. The other point also is that, Professor Levin talked about world-class universities, and to me, education is layered. There are multiple rungs, and there are layers there, and there is excellence to be discovered and implemented in each layer. We have this habit of perhaps excessively focusing on the IITs and the IIMs, the capstones of our Indian education, higher education system. And perhaps what really needs to be done is to recognize there are multiple rungs, and that's the point I think Raji was making as well, and then look for excellence and look for quality across each rung, and make that as an anchor of conversation as well, rather than this excessive amount of focus. And yesterday, Professor Prahlad was talking about discovering diversity in India and celebrating diversity in India. And to me, I submit that this is one other dimension of diversity in India. The monochromatic view of building excellent world-class education, which is i.e. equal to the world-class universities of the West, I'm proposing maybe expanded to a more colorful approach or a diverse approach which touches on each rung. And finally, I think a lot of conversation, pretty much all the conversation today, is centered around infrastructure and the amount of money that is required for infrastructure to be created. I'm not even touching on the point that Raji did, which is in terms of where is it going to come from, and so on and so forth. And I'm again submitting that we have to equally move away from being exclusively focused on infrastructure to start talking about the individual. If India is going to succeed, it is because the individuals, the youngsters, are provided with choice, are provided with an opportunity for them to excel, are provided with economic and other support. I'm talking about scholarships, guaranteed student loans, and all of that. They are provided with a construct which allows them to excel, reaching to the point that Bill Green mentioned about outcomes. Now, outcomes are as much a responsibility of the individual as they are of an institution. And at the end of the day, the employer, i.e. the Accentures of the world, are actually going to be hiring individuals. So unless and until the conversation steers away from being almost exclusively focused on infrastructure to something which is a lot more broad, where the individual is celebrated, I think we are going to be. So these are two, and India loves dichotomy, right? So there is a diversity part, and there is the individual part. I think we need to be able to hold both equally and approach it equally.
Thank you, Anna. Shantanu, I'm going to come to you. I know you've been waiting very patiently for this. One of the issues is, and you've been handling software solutions for education, is looking at curriculum. For some odd reason, we seem to be stuck in the past, a time warp. Universities don't revise their curriculum for almost 10, 15 years. Things are moving so rapidly. There's a transformation happening, and yet we don't seem to reflect that even in school education. What do you think needs to be done? And where are the, if there's some advice you can give, where could this be?
Yes, Raj, thanks. Actually, if you look at, great higher education clearly starts at the school level, and that is what the minister also said. If you look at the school system in India, there are just two layers. Either a school affiliates itself to the Central Board of Secondary Education, which in economic terms really translates into you need to have capital of $3 to $4 million to actually set up a CBSE school, because that's the way the regulation and the framework is actually done. Or you can choose to affiliate with the state boards. Unfortunately, both the CBSE and the state boards have not really relooked at the fundamentals, at the bare sort of underpinnings of their curriculum for a very long time. Our entire approach has been academic excellence, academic rigor, and we have completely forgotten that eventually education, what you get in school, has to link to what the workplace environment needs. And that is why we have problem. We have India that's become a degree-obsessed nation,
And vocational, as Anand really mentioned, is something that is not respectable in the social construct that we have. So clearly there is need to have much more vocational in our curriculum. And there are many, many ways to do it. I think some attempts have been made before, but it's a fundamental change in mindset. We have to get away as a nation from thinking that when a student graduates from grade 12, he needs to go get a college degree. I don't think everybody needs to go to college, and therefore there is huge opportunity for us to explore vocational education. And a number of things have to be done simultaneously. One of the things that is clearly positive today is the fact that there has never been as much money and political will as is available today, but clearly it is much less than what we actually need. Raji mentioned that it is a tenth probably of what we need. So we have to harness all the energies on the table: public sector, private sector, philanthropy. As someone who's from a for-profit education sector, it pains me to see that the for-profit sector of the education economy has actually been kept on the fringes. They have been very successful. They have grown at a very fast pace, but they are still at the fringes. They are like the ancillary to the education economy. They are not core to the education economy. So it might take a while for the national debate on the ideology behind higher education to change. The question is, do we have 10 years to do that? If our goal is universal access to higher education, not simply access to world-class institutions, but access to some form of higher education, be it vocational, be it university, be it community college. I think whatever is on the table today, there is a momentum in private sector investing, there is capital available, and I think we can create the right structures to harness that energy and harness that capital. If we can trust the private sector to build highways and to run our telecom networks, I think we can trust the private sector to play a role. There are many ways to engage, and there are many frameworks to do that. The other big idea that I want to put on the table for the minister is that all our thinking so far has been very inward, and rightfully so, because there are such huge dysfunctionalities in higher education, vocational education, school education in India. But think for a moment about how do we harness the intellectual capital of the teachers in India. I was doing a little bit of reading, and the US earns $16 billion a year by inviting foreign students to participate in the US education system. Australia earns $11 billion. The UK earns $9 billion. It's very expensive to go out and study in the US and the UK and Australia. Can't India become a hub for the rest of the world to come and study? Particularly considering the fact that a very large proportion of faculty in higher education across the world, especially the United States of America, is actually of Indian origin. There are 7 million teachers in India. With proper faculty development, there are large markets in Africa, in Latin America, in South Asia that we could capture. That could be a way for us to raise the next $10 billion for higher education in India. If you look at what Dubai has done with the Dubai Education City, now this is a small little nation, has no great pedigree in higher education. There are 30,000 foreign students that study in Dubai today, and there are 32 international universities that operate there. Can we perhaps think of a special education or special economic zone for education, where in that limited area, you relax some of those laws of capacity control, laws of price control that have been really stifling entrepreneurship in private education in India? I think there is a clear opportunity to do that in the context that if we have to get the private sector engaged, there are perhaps many different ways to do it, rather than a binary view saying for-profit or not-for-profit.
Thank you, Shantanu. I think you've raised some very important issues, particularly the ideological questions. I want Kapil to come. I know, Kapil, you've got a whole lot of pointers that have been put forward by our speakers, but one was this answer to this for-profit, not-for-profit. Where do you stand on this? Second, of course, as Rajat pointed out, the entire business of privatization. How can private companies or corporates be involved in education in a large way, not illegally as it's there, but officially, and participate in meeting this demand gap that is there, or supply gap, really?
Let me
let me just try and answer the question of for-profit or not for-profit, because I think we must understand conceptually what we should understand by what for-profit is. One way of looking at it is that a corporation which is listed in the stock market, invests in education, and then through education pays dividends to its shareholders. If that kind of setup is allowed in the education sector, my position is no. Okay? That doesn't mean that there should be no surpluses in education. So you must make a distinction between profit and surplus. If profit means giving dividends to shareholder from fees paid by our parents of children for getting school and college education, I think that's the wrong way to go about it. Nowhere in the world does it happen. Okay? People don't earn money from fees. And if the stock market goes bust, you can't allow institutions to go bust. So I think that's a risk that no nation can take, number one. Yes, the private sector should be allowed in a big way in the education sector, both at higher education and at school education level, and should be allowed to make surpluses to invest back into the education sector. I don't quite agree with Raji's proposition that the market itself will ultimately determine which institutions will survive, which we don't. Because education is not something like setting up a company and having it wound up. We can't wind up institutions in this country. So we cannot allow education to be subject to risk factors, which are acceptable in normal commercial enterprises. So my position on that is quite clear. I think Rick made a very important point. And I don't quite agree with that we shouldn't concentrate on world-class universities and we should really look at levels of excellence at different levels of education. I think, what do world-class universities do? We must understand that. World-class universities create national wealth. World-class universities cross the boundaries that are required to be crossed for the innovations and inventions of tomorrow. They become the leaders of knowledge, and therefore that exponentially results in creation of wealth as you move on. So we need and we must have world-class universities. That doesn't sort of take away from Bill's point that the water table in the tank must rise. We can't say we'll only have world-class universities, but we'll do nothing with the other universities that are out there. We must bring up their, and in order to do that, I go back to Raji's point, we must allow flexibility. We must allow flexibility within the student community. I would like a class 12 student who has got vocational training to go to, say, a polytechnic and move back to academics if he so wants. We should allow that cross-fertilization of disciplines and ideas, and that's absolutely necessary. We must move the government away from regulation. We're already putting in place such a law, and hopefully that will be passed soon. And the regulator must not be composed of government nominees. It must be composed of experts in the field. And those experts should be nominated not by government, but by a collegium of experts, which has nothing to do with government, so that there is transparency in the process. So those are some of the questions I wanted to answer. A couple of other things, vocational training. I think that's exceptionally important. Let me give you a figure which will surprise you. Of the 9 million people who are in the workforce, 70% of them haven't got primary education. So you're talking about 300 million, 50 million people who are not educated at all. What skill development is going to take place? So we need to set the school system right. We need those people at least to pass class 8, class 10, then move on to vocational and skill training. So unless you solve that problem, you're not going to get the numbers that you're talking about. And Venki, you're not going to solve that problem through computer courses, because they haven't been to primary school. Right? So you need to actually get that right. Now, what you're talking about will help at the higher level of education, right? Technology will be extremely helpful in, amongst college graduates who have the requisite knowledge skills. But as I said, that's only 12%. So we need that critical mass to move up to 30%, which is what I said in the beginning. So I think all of you have made some exceptionally valid points, but the most important point is we have no time. That's what you said. We really have no time. And when people ask me this question, why are you in a hurry? I said, I always say, this should have happened 15 years ago.
Well, we should
I'm
have
not
had
in
you
a hurry.
Kapil 15 years back. Maybe that would have made a difference. But I know Richard is on his way out. Kapil, may I just...
So I was just trying to respond to each of the speakers.
Sure. No,
and I think each of you have made very, very valid and
I think you've given sweet music in the process to a lot of them. Richard, before you leave, I know you've got to go at 11:30. 2 points. One, of course, is looking at how America addressed this profit, not-for-profit question. How did you all do that? If you can, And second, there's been this talk, I quickly want to get you in on this foreign university bill that we've been proposing. It's supposed to be passed by Parliament and get into law. What would you like to see that? What would it take for Yale, for instance, to set up a campus here on this?
Okay. On the for-profit versus not-for-profit issue, there are a few...
Your mic, I think. Yeah. Your mic.
It's on. Yeah. I mean, the light's on at least. Does that work? With respect to for-profit institutions, there are some in America. They do, actually the most successful have done sort of mass education on the internet at this point. And there are for-profit vocational schools, quite a lot in abundance. None have risen to the competitive quality levels. They serve a mass market. They do some good, and the best of them are actually serving a good function. So I wouldn't, out of ideological commitment, rule them out as a solution to some of India's needs. But I do understand the minister's point of view that in this context that might not be for now the best way to go. With respect to enticing foreign universities to come set up shop here or form partnerships with Indian universities and schools at various levels, I think it's good to be open to that kind of influence from institutions abroad. I think you'll be disappointed if you think that the very top schools in the world are going to come and set up full-scale comprehensive universities in India. I don't believe that will happen because the requisites are just too daunting, I think, to be taken on by by an institution of our type. And as I said, it takes a long time. So the great universities are unlikely to dilute their brand by starting with a comprehensive approach without a faculty of the quality that we have now. The real measure of what makes a world-class university is the quality of the faculty, and are they leaders in research? Are they the leaders in the world in the research in their field, and are they the ones driving innovation of the sort that builds wealth in the economy? That's how all these league tables are really based on the research quality of the institutions. And it's very hard to get there from scratch, and very few top-level universities are going to try to do that from the ground up. Much more promising would be partnerships, would be affiliations, as you did when you set up the IITs. You affiliated them with foreign institutions as advisors, as consultants on how to build a faculty, as partners in exchanging faculty. These sorts of things, I think, can happen and be very productive. So opening up to a very liberal, the variety of terms and contractual relationships that you allow between foreign institutions and Indian institutions, I think that is very promising. And I'd certainly encourage you in that.
Thank you, Richard. And you may leave if you have to go at this thing. Kapil, you wanted to come in.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention that I quite agree with Rick. I don't expect Harvard Law School to come and set up a Harvard Law School in India. Right? But what is happening, and I can tell you this right away, that lots of universities are saying we want twinning arrangements with Indian institutions. 2 years here, 2 years there. I think that's of enormous benefit to the Indian student community. We want research arrangements, right, in top-level research institutions. And some of the lesser, I mean, I'm not the real top-class universities, but University of North Carolina, University of Texas, University of Washington, have come to me and said, yes, we want to actually do something substantial in India. So the real hungry players in the education sector, even across the Atlantic, are quite happy to come. But the top levels will not reduce their brand, but they will slowly test the waters And 5, 10 years from now, or 15 years from now, you actually might see them here. You agree? Good.
Thank you. Thank you, Richard. I'm going to open this out for questions from the audience right now. I know there's a whole lot of life. Quickly before that, Kapil, are you going to bring this foreign university bill in this session of the thing? And what do you hope to get through in the education sector in this particular session of Parliament?
I want the world, but I don't think that's going to happen. Politics is, you know, to get people moving, to change mindsets.
But is there one thing you want in this session that you would like to get through?
Well, there are several. There are several that we'll introduce.
And the most important being
I think what's going to happen is that our setting up of the, you know, the overarching body will happen by the budget session, right? But all the other...
I do not think that inter-regional differences in state performance should be viewed as a failure of policy. If we are going to give states more freedom and flexibility, and after all, you know, when you run a liberalized economy, the industrialists don't have to come to the central government to get permission to put their factories in A state rather than B state. They just choose wherever they want to do it. The consequence is that if some states are better governed or get their act together faster or are better endowed, they're going to get more private investment. The lesson for this is the ones that aren't getting it ought to try to find out why are investors going there, rather than simply saying there's some inherent unfairness in the whole thing. And my feeling is if that lesson is learned, if states that are not doing well ask themselves, why are the states that are doing well, I think we'll solve half the problem. Now, some of the times, the reason they're doing well is locational. I mean, if you're sitting by, if you're on the seaside, and it's very difficult for a landlocked state to solve that problem. But then there are other things you can do to bring about competitive efficiency. That said, let me say the central government does a lot of redistribution. We have many schemes in the central. First of all, the sharing of central revenues is on a progressive basis. So a state with a lower per capita income gets more per person than a state with a higher per capita income. So there is a kind of a built-in effort to redress this. Many of the government schemes are explicitly designed to fill in gaps in infrastructure. So states that have got left behind, we kind of help make up infrastructure deficits for them. But to my mind, the most important single thing is that the message must go out that in a liberalized economy, states must try to attract investment. That's what countries do, and I don't see any reason why states shouldn't do it. And the good news, by the way, is that states are doing it. I think this message is getting across. So I'm not at all, pessimistic about how this system will play out over time.
Shumeet.
And incidentally, I mean, the proof of that is the states that were #1 6 or 7 years ago are not #1 today. The states that have shot ahead are not the states that were the richest. They are, in fact, middle-income states that have now moved forward. And even amongst the poorest states, while it is true that not all the poorest states have done well, some of the poorest states have done well. So something's happening.
Shumeet, you wanted to come in?
Well, I just wanted to say that, you know, if you sort of draw a line through the country down the middle through the city of Nagpur, that states that are to the west of this look very different to the states that are to the right. And I think there are real differences in the governance quality and execution in some of these places. So I would agree that there is something there. I mean, by the way, the other strategy to deal with the law of averages is to knock the chap who is at the top down, so the averages actually come down, and the rest of us don't look as bad, but that's not one I recommend. The point, though, is that I was just make a comment here, which is that I met a gentleman called Ashraf Ghani recently who ran as a presidential candidate, was finance minister in Afghanistan. He has a wonderful book called Failed States, and in fact compares some regions in India to some of these places, a couple of billion people in these conditions. And he said to us that the most striking way to make a difference in these situations is to change how governance works on the ground. That it's the experience of everyday people and their faith in the state is entirely determined by what happens to them in their everyday lives.
Right.
And so, you know, I said this before in passing, but this demographic dividend question and its conversion into something different, which is, I mean, it's not incidental that these states to the east also have a much higher incidence of Maoist insurgencies. I think the quality of life is not just a demand-side attraction, you know, to give the country 12% growth. I think it's also a human imperative.
So it's how the local policeman behaves, it's how the local teacher behaves.
How the local revenue authority behaves.
Right.
Does that water pipe that's been promised in the Hill District for, 30 years actually show up?
Yeah. Gentleman right here. Just wait for the...
My name is Mike Johnston. I'm from the United States. In the next 1 to 2 years, what, if anything, could derail the 6.5 to 8 or 9% growth rates that are anticipated? In other words, what could come out of left field in India that would affect it on the downside that we're not now looking at?
Who wants to go on that? Yeah.
Well, one thing which could derail, of course, is the growth in the rest of the world. I mean, much as we would like to think that, we will be the source of consumption and production, for a long time yet, India and China and the rest of Asia will be very dependent on the industrialized world, US, the Eurozone. So therefore, if the economic growth in the industrialized world were not to take place as we think it should, or will rather, India's growth rate obviously will be affected. So that's, I think, one very important thing. The other one is if there is premature withdrawal of the fiscal and monetary stimulus in this whole region and the industrialized world as well. So it's very important to coordinate these so-called exit strategies. So I would think that these are the two major points which could derail the growth story that we're talking about in the short term.
Anyone else want to pick up risks? Yeah.
If I may. I think the only other thing is the geopolitical situation. We do live in a neighborhood which is extremely tense, so that could basically have some impact. The other thing that could slow down is policy response if you really see the inflation numbers climb up very quickly. Whilst a lot of it has to do with supply side constraints, the traditional response of the policymakers is to say, let's tighten now, let's increase interest rates, and that could have a dramatic impact on growth.
Montek, as I understand it, the official view right now is that inflation is worth watching, but is not a critical matter that requires speedy action, correct?
Yeah, I think the real concern on the prices front is that you've got food price inflation somewhat high. I think, most of our indices have weights which are completely out of sync with what is relevant for the average person. I mean, for example, the consumer price index gives a weight of about 65% to food, whereas if you look at the average in the national sample survey, it should be 30 or so. So therefore, I think if you focus only on food price inflation, it is on the high side. But my feeling is that reflects partly the bad monsoon. And since I expect that the late rains will make a big difference to the winter crop, and also that next year we assume a normal monsoon, this is not a phenomenon that reflects some fundamental supply side problem. So I expect that by the end of this financial year, food price inflation will come down. It's quite possible that some of the other inflation will go up. But I think we are on target for ending the year sort of 5 to 6% inflation. I'd like it to be 5 rather than 6, but at a point when growth is actually distinctly below potential, the balance of concern is essentially with maintaining the growth rate. And that's why virtually all the authorities talking about it in India, including, I think, the Reserve Bank, have said that in the Reserve Bank's case, the two key policy rates have been left unchanged. Though, like every other central bank, they've said, well, we need to be thinking about when to reverse exceptional monetary accommodation. And I think that's not an unreasonable position. It'll be time enough at the beginning of the next financial year to see what we should do. And if it turns out that growth is indeed back to 7.5%, and that inflation is going too high, well, they'll have enough time to take corrective steps. But right now, I don't think we're in a position where the inflation issue is anything other than something to keep a close watch on. And that's really what official policy has been based on. You know, on the other question of what might, I mean, it's always fascinating what might derail, because the glib answer is, no, I don't think anything is going to derail. Now, I mean, that's like saying, I don't see any black swans out there.
Right.
Now, we know that there can be any number of black swans. But quite frankly, I think it's a fairly robust assumption that unless the world shoots itself in the foot, our task will be quietly to try to get back to a higher growth path, even though the world isn't going to get back to that path. And I think the key issue there is, unlike some other countries, our growth was not dependent, nor meant to be dependent, on a huge export effort. Our approach on this is really focus on the supply side. If India can produce at a rate which allows a 9% growth in supply every year, we can run the system in a manner in which the demand for that will be available, and whatever deficiencies there are can be made up by a much higher investment in infrastructure, which is what we need. Now, if we do that, the downside of it is if we're not getting exports for the next 2 or 3 years, and we're doing a lot of investment, well, we'll have a wider current account deficit, sure. But you know, India at the moment, I mean, for the last 5 years, has been running virtually a balanced. Moving to a current account deficit of 2, even 2.5% of GDP would be doing the world a favor. We would be injecting demand into the rest of the global economy. And we can do that if this demand can be financed. Now, what does that mean? For India to finance a current account deficit of 2.5% of GDP means a net inflow of maybe $25 billion, not a big sum. Certainly not for a country that is sitting on $280 billion or whatever it is of reserves. I find it very difficult to believe that unless the world has decided to say goodbye to normal economic activity, and it is in fact clawing its way back to normalcy, I find it very difficult to believe that international financial flows will not enable India to sustain that kind of deficit. If that's so, then I think we can generate all the demand we want. I think, as Raghu pointed out, it will affect the kind of things we produce. We won't all be producing golf sets for the United States. We'll be producing things that fit into whatever the local or indeed developing country demand structure is, but no harm in that, really.
Very good. Any more questions? Yes. One microphone heading over there. Keep your hand up so that the person with the microphone can see you. Thank you.
My name is Manish Prakash. I represent SK Group in Korea. I'm the Vice President for International Business. Economic outlook that talks of 9 and 10% growth rates, I would believe, looking from the outside, will need a tighter or a smarter integration with the world economy as well, the global integration of Indian economy. And the way I see it for trade, for investments, for innovation, to get to that level of growth rates. Now, if you look outside, you see various forms of trading blocks that are out there, like the NAFTA, you talk about EU, ASEAN, and recently this North Asian trading bloc, where you see Japan, Korea, and China coming together. India right now is not a part of, or is not seen to be a part of any of such relationships. I'm curious to understand how is India thinking about these issues from a trading relationship perspective. Thank you.
Rajat, do you want to come in on?
Well, probably Montek should take this, but yeah, I'll certainly. I think it is true that East Asia is certainly more integrated. And it is true that India doesn't belong to many of those clubs. But I think it's also true that India, ASEAN FTAs is, I think, close to being negotiated or already is. India is certainly talking to some of the other countries. Ultimately, the conclusion of the Doha round is the first best. I think everybody recognizes that and is working to it. But while that's the first best, I think we've got to be realistic and take whatever second best comes the way. And I think India's strategy has been to keep the eyes on Doha, but also work on some of the FTAs, regional FTAs that India is working on. So I don't think there is any denial of the importance of being integrated. It's a question of the timing. I should make another point, which is always a source of disappointment for me, that the integration in South Asia is much less. That intra-regional trade within South Asia, which could be much higher and for various reasons isn't, I think provides India a great opportunity, which is being missed and should be capitalized on.
Montek, you want a quick word on it?
I think it's broadly correct that clearly in the long term, I mean, it's the global trading system, the Doha round, et cetera, which is the guarantee of open markets. It is true that we have in fact signed a free trade agreement with the ASEAN, which is now a done deal and is going to play out in the next, whatever the period is, that those tariffs will be reduced. So we are in fact following both strategies. On South Asia, I agree. I mean, I think it's not for want of trying on India's part, but actually given the relative size of the other economies to India, it's hugely more important for the other economies than it is for India. But the history of SAARC is one where we have been perfectly willing to push ahead with free trade agreements and opening up access, et cetera. Not all of our partner countries have been of the same view. Well, that's unfortunate, but perhaps it'll change in future.
I'm afraid we have to bring an absolutely fascinating conversation on India's economic outlook to a close. So please join me in thanking Kalpana Morparia, Rajat Nag, Shumeet Banerji, of course Montek Ahluwalia, Lars, Thunell, and Raghuram Rajan. Thank you all very much indeed for a fascinating afternoon.